All right. So it's 9 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. We want to welcome you to this webinar, which is the first webinar of this year, 2022, from the Higher Education Engagement and Transformation Community of Practice. It's a pleasure to be here today. Albina, who's based in Kazakhstan, is in an airport right now, and myself, based in Washington, D.C., are your hosts for today. Just want to make sure you're in the right webinar. We are focusing today on climate change and education. Welcome all, and Albina is going to talk about the agenda.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Yolanda. So you can see our happy faces here. Yolanda and I, we run this community of practice, and this 6 months, it's kind of new year for our community of practice. We have decided to talk about an interesting topic. So let's go to agenda. Yeah, before we go to agenda, there is a small webinar housekeeping you can read here. And if you have any problems, you can contact Stephanie in direct message, and she will.
Going in and out. This is the problem with these international things.
Yeah. Can we have next slide, please?
Be better on the computer.
So today, we're gonna talk about, as we have done small introductions, please keep writing your name, your country you're from, your favorite food in the chat. And it's awesome, we connect from different places. I'm in the airport at the moment. So it's good, it connects internet and helps us, gives us chance to talk, to meet each other, network. We will do small refresh. We will tell about what is HEET, what is our vision, what is what we have done so far the last year. Then we will have 2 amazing presentations. First one with Beth Johnson from USAID Center for Education. Beth will talk about advancing climate action in and through education. Then we have Dr. Christina Kwauk presenting green skills. After these 2 presentations, you'll have a chance to have some Q&A discussions, and we'll talk about how does it all and can it apply to higher education. And we will wrap up telling our next plans. Next slide. So I'm giving floor to Yolanda to do some recap about what is HEET.
Yes, thank you, Albina. So for a lot of you are new to this structure, we are part of a community of practice that focuses on higher education. It's got this beautiful name, Higher Education Engagement Transformation, and our aim is to connect universities worldwide, universities and higher education institutions worldwide, to engage on issues that we see as priority for both research, for faculty, for students, for positive youth development, to help youth get not only an education, but also prepare for work. This community of practice has been in place for over a year. It is funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, through a mechanism called YouthPower, which intends to empower youth to do to develop their skills and prepare for healthy and productive lives. So this community of practice is looking at engaging youth, but also higher education institutions. Right now, we are focusing on climate change, and that's what we're going to hear about today. Next slide, please. You are, of course, welcome to join this community of practice. It's a community of practice, which means it's free, which is great. It's really helping connect people from all over the world. It's a great network. If you go to this youthpower.org site, you will see what our higher education engagement transformation community of practice is doing, called HEET, but also the others. Business, entrepreneurship, private sector, gender. There's a terrific community of practice from the youth in the Middle East. Looking at system strengthening research. So please join. Next slide. So we
Thank you, Yolanda.
Oh, it's you. Go ahead, Albina.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm jumping in, sorry.
Please.
So what did we achieve in 2021? As Yolanda said, we are great community of practice, like working group, global platform, which gives a chance for learning events, to talk, to discuss. And if you look at this timeline, you can see we have done a lot of webinars last year, a lot of meetings, and we launched in March 2021. And through our journey to this time, we have done kind of presentations about what is positive youth development and how does it relate to higher education? What is changing role of universities for youth workforce development? We brought a lot of case studies from developing contexts like Indonesia, Central Asia, Africa, and we tried to organize interesting meetings like donor and implementer cafe. So anyone from youth sector, NGOs, they could ask donors, what are their priorities? How can they apply for grants? Because it's usually difficult to reach out donors. So we gave this opportunity for a lot of like 100+ members attending our events. And usually we also organize small CoP members networking so people could meet each other and come up with amazing things. We also presented at Global Education Summit. We talked about soft skills development, education, and positive youth development last year at GPE conference. So this is shortly what we have done so far. And now what will you plan to do? Next slide, please. So I'm giving floor to Yolanda to introduce our first speaker.
Yes, thank you. Just one more thing from what we achieved last year, all the meetings were recorded. So you can go to youthpower.org and just look for the recording. The cafe between donors and implementers that Albina talked about is precious. A lot of people don't know how to work with the US government. Please go to it. We wanted to provide that resource to you. So Beth Johnson, of course, is a wonderful colleague, and she is taking the climate action agenda into the world of education. And Beth is going to present what USAID is doing. Beth has been changing the world one step at a time. This is my own interpretation, Beth. Changing the world, especially in the US, one step at a time. She spent years working on the Hill with Congress, trying to steer investments towards education so that all the work that we all do today and we're going to continue doing for the next few years has been really relying the foundations that Beth and her team has put in place for the past few years. Right now, she's working on issues of gender at the Center for Education here in Washington, D.C., but she's also promoting the education climate change agenda. Beth, did I?
Thank you. That was a very generous introduction, Yolanda. Thank you very much.
All right, the floor is yours, Beth.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Yep, I'm Beth Johnson, and I'm in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm representing USAID's Center for Education in the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation, BDI. I want to thank Yolanda and Albina and the Making Sense team for organizing this event. I also want to recognize Samantha Alvis, who leads our USAID higher education work, but wasn't available to attend today, and Lisa Blonder and Rebecca Pagel, who co-lead our EduClimate working group in the Center for Education at AID. I think Lisa's on the call, actually, so hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
Yeah, so just to say we have a great group of people working hard to elevate these issues at USAID across sectors and offices. And there's a ton of momentum. So we're really excited to be doing this work. I know we have some USAID implementing partners on the call. I saw Lisa Phillips. I recognize some familiar names from my time at the Basic Education Coalition. And I'm just really excited to be joining this great group of thought leaders. I think this is a really critical moment for both climate and education. So I'm super glad that this is on the agenda for HEET. And I'm going to do a quick 15-minute presentation today I'm going to start with a brief overview of higher ed in USAID's policy. Then we'll dive into how USAID is thinking about the intersections of education and climate change, as well as ways we see education contributing to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. We'll take a look at 6 very straightforward strategies that we recommend for integrating climate action into existing programming across the education spectrum, all the way from pre-primary through higher ed. And I have a few concrete examples of how USAID's higher ed programs and partners are embracing these strategies. So hopefully we'll all leave feeling very inspired. Finally, we'll touch on the role of higher ed in the forthcoming USAID climate strategy, which is very exciting. Okay, I've built in a few opportunities to pause and reflect in the presentation, but feel free to, of course, use the chat box, share your ideas, your comments, and your questions throughout. And I believe there will be time to share aloud and discuss after both of the presentations are completed. So let's get started. Yes, first slide, perfect. So USAID works to promote and demonstrate democratic values abroad and advance a free, peaceful, and prosperous world. We want to engage more frequently and intensely with a broader range of partners, especially local organizations and companies based in the countries where we work. In the education sector, our focus is on improving learning outcomes from pre-primary through higher ed and ensuring the most marginalized have equitable access to safe, quality, and inclusive education. In our higher ed programming, we often work across sectors and with a wide variety of HEIs, higher education institutions.
Sorry, do we see presentation or just the first slide?
So we're on this slide that says USAID education policy.
Ah, so we're on the right page. I thought you are flipping slides, but we don't see them. Okay, no problem. Go ahead.
No, I think we're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, though. Good question. Okay. Let's see. So, yeah. Are we on slide 3? Let's see the next slide. Yeah, there we go. Higher education program framework. So well-functioning higher education systems in USAID's partner countries are central to our education policy. In the education sector, we work to build the capacity of higher ed institutions in partner countries so they can be drivers of development. We also view higher education systems as a means to achieving other development goals. Our USAID higher ed program framework is available on edulinks.org, and you'll see that it puts higher ed at the center of development. We know that higher ed plays a role in every sector where USAID works, either as a partner or as a beneficiary. And as, of course, all of you know, higher ed systems provide quality and relevant education and training, advance knowledge and research, and engage and strengthen networks and communities. So since 2014, we've been able to track nearly 800 activities across regions and sectors that work with or through higher education. If you haven't seen it yet, you should check out the USAID Support to Higher Education map, which is also available on EduLinks. And I'll make sure to share these links when I'm done presenting. All right, next slide, please. So let's turn to how we at USAID are thinking about the intersections between climate and education, why we're all here today. A lot of the information can be found on EduLinks and is the product of collaboration between USAID's EduClimate Working Group that I mentioned and consultations with external stakeholders. So thank you to everybody who has already contributed your input. Next slide. Thanks. So as we're all becoming increasingly aware, climate change poses challenges to education infrastructure and learning outcomes. Climate challenges impact marginalized populations disproportionately by worsening poverty and exacerbating non-climate stressors. The effects of climate change are manifesting differently around the world. So some climate risks to education include education institutional closures due to overheated buildings, structural damage due to sea level rise or flooding, heavy precipitation, interruptions to attendance and reduced learning due to vector-borne diseases, extreme heat and disaster-related displacement, reduced household incomes and increased farming hardship due to drought and seasonal changes, which leaves families less able to invest in education, and of course, increased migration of the most marginalized for work due to climate change's effects on rural livelihoods. So let's take a moment to consider, no, go back, don't, yeah, there we go, good, okay. Let's take a moment to consider the first reflection question here. So I know we have people on this call from all over the world. How have you observed climate-related challenges to education, either where you live or where you work? And who is being impacted the most by these challenges? So feel free to share in the chat box or just prep some thoughts for the discussion later on in the session. But we really do want to know what you see happening.
Yeah, can I add something?
Yes, actually, Ahmad.
Oh, not now. You mean not now? The question is not to be answered now, right?
Perfect. Can you?
Yeah.
Okay, think about it. Either put it in the chat box, and then we'll loop back, or we have some discussion time built in at the end. But yeah, I really want to hear what you have to say. So just take a few seconds to think. I see food insecurity and child undernourishment. Absolutely. Missed days due to extreme weather. This happens all over the world. Hurricanes in the southern US, absolutely. All right, so keep those going and let's move on to the next slide. Cool. Okay, so now let's think about how education can contribute to climate action. First of all, strong education systems, all the way from pre-primary through higher ed, can implement proactive measures to reduce climate shocks and stressors in the long term. For example, we can power buildings with renewable energy. We can choose fuel-efficient options for transporting learners to and from schools. We can apply climate-smart practices to book supply chains. We can conduct research to develop green technologies. And of course, we can train the green workforce. Education fosters pro-environmental decision-making and helps people to develop skills for green jobs and climate leadership. So we are so enthusiastic about joining the climate movement. In terms of adaptation and resilience, education equips people with the knowledge, skills, and opportunities to adapt to and overcome climate challenges, of course. And education systems with strong emergency response capacities can minimize the disruption due to climate events such as droughts and hurricanes. Technical, vocational, and higher education, in partnership with the private sector, prepares job seekers for energy, agriculture, and other sectors to support more climate resilient societies and economies. Next slide, please. Great. So in our work to advance climate action in and through education, our team at USAID Center for Education and across the different offices have outlined 6 climate action strategies where higher ed plays a central role. First, helping education leaders to build more resilient systems. This includes planning for climate resilience and green infrastructure, an area that intersects with a lot of the work that we've been doing in response to the pandemic. Second, supporting youth through technical and vocational education and in partnership with the private sector to build skills for green jobs, including climate smart agriculture. Leveraging the research capacity and community engagement components of higher education systems and institutions to serve as climate action leaders and knowledge generators, so important, and increasing the focus on climate risk management. We can all improve staff and implementing partner capacity through trainings such as Climate Resilient Development 101 and what is climate risk management process, 2 trainings from USAID. So this is our second reflection question. What climate action strategies have you seen taking place in education systems? And how is higher education leading or contributing to those strategies? Again, just brainstorm any thoughts in the chat box, and it'll be good preparation for our discussion later on. All right, next slide. Oh, I see integration of climate themes in early education programs. Absolutely. I know there's some good work happening in the Philippines and Morocco. Upgrading climate curriculum and mainstreaming of climate education into multiple disciplines. Yes. Fabulous. All right, so I have a few examples of putting these strategies into action to share in higher education space. So aligned with the strategy of putting climate themes in curriculum, USAID and the US Forest Service worked with 14 universities and training institutions from the Asia Pacific region to develop an innovative climate change curriculum for the Asia Pacific region. Aligned with supporting youth through education and training, and positive youth development, a public-private partnership in Morocco, H2O Maghreb activity advances cutting-edge solutions to urgent water needs while improving the skills and employability of young Moroccans in the water sector. And third, also the program is helping a Moroccan higher education institution to provide a market-driven training program in a newly established water training hub. Aligned with leveraging research capacity of higher education in the work that our colleagues in the Innovation Technology and Research Hub, which was formerly known as the Global Development Lab, as you may have known it, they support it in partnership to advance research and innovation under the Higher Ed Solutions Network portfolio. USAID supported a higher ed partnership in Ghana between Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and University Technology and Arizona State University to develop a global center for training, generating, and translating supply chain management research and innovations into positive development outcomes for Ghana and across Africa. So all of this work has and will continue to support USAID's commitment to target climate change resources strategically, to ramp up climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts, and to further integrate climate change considerations into international development and humanitarian assistance programs across all of the sectors that USAID works in. Education staff have also been heavily involved in the development of USAID's climate strategy. Next slide. Great. So you might already be aware that USAID recently released a draft of our 2022-2030 climate strategy for public review. And you might be wondering, how can higher education play a critical and collaborative role in the climate strategy's implementation over the next 8 years? I'll refer you back to our preliminary guidance and those 6 strategies for advancing climate action in and through education that are listed on education links. The draft of USAID's climate strategy's second strategic objective, and again, this is the draft, is to drive systems change by catalyzing transformative shifts to net zero and climate resilient pathways. To achieve this objective, the strategy highlights the importance of supporting higher education institutions and the local academics to advance research, innovations, and the development of an educated workforce needed to drive and maintain systems change. Indeed, the education sector's advancing climate action in and through education guidance reinforces the key role higher ed can play in transformative systemic change. Further, USAID will develop agency implementation guidance coming soon to support the implementation of the climate strategy. So stay tuned for this guidance after the strategy launch later this spring, and there will be more detailed information on getting involved. So the link is there on the slide. It's the USAID Climate Strategy website. And this brings us to our final reflection question. How will you advance climate action in your own work or lives? What additional resources or guidance do you need? And that last part of the question is really important. We want to know from you what you need to be able to do this work at your utmost potential. Great. And how, checking in with the host, how am I doing on time? Do we have time to share out a few of these comments, or should we hold them till the end?
I think we can share some of the comments. We have a couple of minutes. And
Great.
We would love to hear from you all what you're doing, and please share with us, and because we can amplify.
Ahmad, did you want to start it off? I know you had a comment.
Yeah, actually, I've been working in Jordan particularly, and recently in Jordan and Lebanon, in a climate change adaptation mega project funded by the Adaptation Fund. Basically, they are focusing on finding adaptation measures in the water sector, the first degree, because, you know, in the Arab countries like Jordan and Lebanon, there is scarcity of water. I have found during managing 2 mega projects I finished one for Jordan Ministry of Planning, and right now I'm a consultant with one with UN Habitat. That and looking now, I'm now in Louisiana, United States, looking at the capabilities and facilities and resources at U.S. higher education and universities. There is a big gap, and when we try to take advantage of the U.S. Experience, I'm talking about the universities, it's hard. Sometimes we try to contact experts, consultants, trainers, capacity building personnel to see if we can take advantage of their expertise. There is no clear mechanism. For example, now talking about this important lecture, why don't we start something or establish a platform where we can take advantage of the engineering departments, for example, where a student from USA can help design adaptation measures in those developing countries while they are implementing their projects, because they don't have, the enough capacity. We hardly can find consultant and engineer offices in those Arab countries to design those measures. So to make it sure, we need a mechanism or a platform to facilitate the U.S. experience, engineering, for example, and science, in all, in those projects. They are already funded, money is there, so the students will benefit, and their faculties in their thesis research, and those developing countries also will benefit from this experience. That's my point.
Thank you, Hamad. This is exactly what we're trying to do with this community of practice, is link universities with each other. And I don't know who from US universities is here in this community of practice meeting today, but I know we have members like University of Texas and Florida State University and Michigan who have just extraordinary experience and can connect with you.
I also, I saw, thank you so much, Matt. That's an awesome point. I also saw Nora, Nick, and maybe Martha also mentioned integrating climate themes into existing education programming. And I would love to hear more about that, if those are some strategies that you've observed in your own practice. Not to put you on the spot, you can also wait till the discussion.
Let's wait till the discussion,
okay,
if that's okay, because it's wonderful. It's very rich. So thank you. But please, as Beth said, just keep your questions for 20 minutes from now or so. In her presentation, Beth presented the United States strategy for the Agency for International Development. And which is broad. We're zooming into education, which Beth presented. Within the education sector and education arena, Beth mentioned one thing: skills for green jobs, the good skills that we all try to promote. So it's my segue into presenting Christina Kwauk. And next slide, please. And Christina is, if you're looking for one leader in the world about green skills and education, you have her right here. And we're so honored to have Christina Kwauk here. She's been leading the whole thinking about education and climate change. And it is so true. She's a social scientist. She's been working a lot on the intersections of education and gender and girls' education, youth skills, and now climate change. You can see that she has published a lot on climate change and learning, and feel free to check it. Right now, she's a research director at Unbounded Associates, and I follow everything she says. I do everything she tells me to do. I follow everything she says. She's really the leader. The framework she's going to present is the one that will allow us to zoom into what we want to do for climate change and education. Go, Christina. The floor is yours.
Yolande, you're too kind. Thank you so much for that really, really generous introduction. It's my pleasure to be with y'all today. Thank you, Yolande, Albina, and the Making Sense team. So I wanted to start off by sort of situating our minds and sort of centering us on kind of the big picture before getting into the framework. We can see from emerging evidence, observations from the private sector, all things that suggest that young people around the globe not only want greater climate action from their governments, but they also want jobs that are sustainable and environmentally friendly and allow them to connect their concern for the environment and for the climate crisis to the things that they do to generate their livelihoods. They want to work with companies and support companies that align with their values and their ethics. And some youth even report that they're willing to accept lower salaries if their jobs contribute to positive social and environmental change. But the problem is that while many youth aspire to green jobs and green careers, many believe that they do not have the necessary green skills for these jobs. And even more young people are located in geographies where the opportunities to gain such green skills are few and far between. So while there is huge need for a discussion about all of the education sector, including basic education, I'm going to focus my remarks today on the role that post-secondary institutions play. Higher education, technical vocational education and training, and other post-secondary learning environments are really critical spaces for building green skills, including climate resilience and adaptive capacities that build on local community and cultural assets for a just transition. And this is especially the case for older as well as younger workers in many contexts that I think our audience today here works in, who are displaced by green economic transitions, as well as the young people, especially girls and women, and those from historically minoritized groups, indigenous communities, and underinvested rural communities who often lack that access to those opportunities. We have to also consider that these populations tend to experience heightened environmental risks due to their proximity to environmental hazards. They're also likely to experience magnified effects of climate change due to structural, social, health, and economic inequities. And these populations have, again, like I said earlier, been historically excluded from education and training opportunities that could strengthen their capacity to respond to climate change and to contribute to a low carbon economy. So today I'm going to offer us a framework to think through as a proposition how post-secondary institutions might approach education and workforce development that supports a just transition. And this framework is called a New Green Learning Agenda and is something that Olivia Casey and I developed while I was at the Brookings Institution. And I want us also to keep in mind that this framework isn't intended to be prescriptive, but rather to provoke the critical thinking needed among education decision makers to help stimulate education systems transformation in a time of climate crisis. So I'll go over some problems that are keeping us from leveraging the full transformative potential of education for climate action and climate justice. And then I'll overview what a New Green Learning Agenda is as a possible solution to these problems. And potentially even how such an agenda can help us focus our education and training systems to build the breadth of green skills that are necessary for climate mitigation, adaptation, transition, and transformation. Next slide, please. Okay, so the way I like to start is by reminding everyone that how we frame the climate crisis matters, especially when it comes to defining the parameters of the system of education and training solutions that we have at hand. So on the one hand, climate change is a technical challenge. We understand this from our science backgrounds that due to human activity over the last century, the Earth's atmosphere has more greenhouse gases than it can naturally absorb, trapping greenhouse gases and causing average temperatures around the world to rise. We know this. With the problem, though, focused on greenhouse gases and especially carbon dioxide, the solution that follows within our broader global policy discourse is to decrease the amount of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere by removing existing emissions and mitigating against further emissions. One of the social adaptations needed in this context is a transition from high carbon economies to low or carbon neutral economies, what we might call a green economy. The implications for the education sector then is not only to limit its own emissions and climate footprint and to ensure its infrastructure is climate resilient, but to also build a green workforce with the specific capacities needed to support a just transition. We've sort of talked about or hinted at this and talked about this earlier. But climate change is also a sociological problem, an adaptive challenge, which requires not just technical skills for wind turbine technicians and solar panel installers, but also new ways of being, thinking, and doing in the world. So on the one hand, we can frame this adaptive challenge as rooted in unsustainable behaviors at the individual level, including one's consumption patterns, one's energy usage, one's lifestyle choices, and so on. In this framing, the role of education then is to shift the individual's generic capacities towards those that generate more sustainable behaviors. So this might include improving the individual's awareness of climate change and their knowledge of the solutions. In high-emitting country contexts, that might mean, driving electric cars or recycling, or it might mean providing the necessary critical thinking and problem-solving skills that, together with technical skills, enable one to adopt vertical farming techniques or climate smart irrigation techniques or so on, right? To adapt low carbon and adaptive technologies. But the adaptive challenge of climate change isn't just a problem of unsustainable individual behavior or a lack of skills at the individual level. It's also one of human systems. And to this effect, if we conceptualize the climate crisis as a symptom of unjust social and economic systems, including those that support carbon capture policies that perpetuate environmental colonialism, or supply chains that involve child labor to extract minerals needed for renewable energy, or the promotion of economic transitions that exclude Black, Indigenous, people of color, women and girls in rural communities, then we shift our role for the education sector to expand the development of transformative capacities of individuals and society to catalyze the broader systems of change for both social and climate justice. So each of these conceptualizations and framings of the climate crisis is valid. All of this is true. The climate crisis is a technical challenge. It is an adaptive challenge. It's both individual and it's systemic. And just as there is no single solution to climate change, there is no single educational solution for climate action. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so the problem though is that much of our discussions are dominated by a focus on closing the emissions gap. So this is the difference between the projected level of greenhouse gas emissions under business as usual and the level of emissions reductions that are needed to achieve the 1.5 degree target. Next slide, please. Not many of our discussions are attending to the education gap, or the difference between our levels of climate knowledge and green skills and climate consciousness under an education as usual scenario, and the level that these need to be increased to in order to achieve our climate goals and our sustainable development goals. So here are just like two snapshots of sort of the gap that we're talking about. So we have to think, in many ways, closing the emissions gap is dependent on closing the education gap. Okay, so now I think that's enough with the problems. Let's get into the solutions. So can I get the next slide, please? Okay, so to help decision makers shift their attention to the education gap and to the technical and adaptive dimensions of the climate crisis, my colleague Olivia Casey and I set out to develop a framework that could help focus the attention of education leaders on a more holistic approach to education for climate action and climate justice. And so to get there, we scoured the literature to understand what kinds of skills matter in the context of climate change mitigation and adaptation and transformation, and how education institutions, including higher education, could better develop these green skills. Can I get the next slide, please? So we found that green skills tended to coalesce around two particular but overlapping paradigms. So on the left side are skills that fell under a green jobs paradigm, the specific capacities that are needed to thrive in green jobs in a low carbon green economy. So skills like environmental management or project management that typically and traditionally technical institutions of training might have focused on. But this side of the continuum also includes your typical STEM skills, your science, technology, engineering, and math skills, your sector-specific skills in transportation or construction or energy or agriculture, as well as your workplace and work readiness skills. So very specific kind of technical capacities, right? And if you go over to the right side are skills for a green transformation, or the transformative capacities needed to disrupt and transform the individual and structural factors that exacerbate the climate crisis. So skills like integrative thinking or systems thinking, or the ability to analyze and navigate unequal systems of power. Skills where perhaps four-year higher education institutions have traditionally gravitated towards. And then shared in between, or shared between these two paradigms of green skills in the middle column are green life skills, or the generic capacities that can contribute to greener ways of thinking, being, and doing. Skills that we commonly target across our post-secondary institution types in the context of sustainability education. Maybe to put it more simply, these are your critical thinking, problem solving, communication, empathy, flexibility, and so on. These skills are sort of soft skills, transversal skills that are oriented towards climate action and sustainability. So we have to also keep in mind that we derived this framework and this middle column especially from the literature, but we also sort of delineate this middle column as distinct, not because it's a distinct set of skills on its own, but because the literature we found gravitating towards the left side of the column, the technical approach, and those skills, the literature that gravitated toward the right side or the more transformative approaches, they both discussed this set of skills as important. So again, kind of reiterating the point that these are kind of like your green life skills or your transferable skills, and so on. So a question for you to noodle on as I continue with the framework is whether and how you see post-secondary institutions moving toward a goal of potentially building all three types of green skills, or this breadth of green skills, instead of segmenting these skills by institutional type, and inadvertently types or segments of society that are oftentimes defined by socioeconomic status and privilege. Okay, so next slide, please. We'll go into now the framework. So from the skills to thinking about theories of change and pathways for implementation, here I'll now introduce the framework underlying our new green learning agenda and how it conceptualizes the breadth of skills needed for climate action and climate justice. So it starts from the position that how we frame the problem underlying the climate crisis shapes our educational pathways. So whether we conceive of the climate crisis as a technical challenge or as an adaptive challenge, that first top row there. And then whether we conceive of the source, or sorry, whether we conceive of the source of the problem as an issue of greenhouse gases, as unsustainable behaviors, or as a symptom of unjust social and economic systems, that second row there. It also considers whether the vision of the solution is a just transition to a green economy, the development of more sustainable behaviors, or the transformation of more equitable systems, that third row there. If you could go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit further down into the framework. So this framework also allows decision makers to deliberately consider a continuum of green skills that are needed to fuel a green economy, as well as climate justice. So from the specific to the generic and the transformative capacity that I talked about in that green skills framework slide, all these breadth of green skills that are required to increase our collective resilience and adaptive capacity. So you could either look at the fourth and fifth row of the framework, or you could look at the the column of definitions right there. So as a heuristic, thanks, I got the two minute time check. So as a heuristic, this framework enables policymakers and stakeholders to gauge where their education system or their education institutions are on an incremental journey towards a more holistic approach to education, training, and workforce development that's oriented towards enabling climate action and achieving climate justice. And again, to be clear, we're arguing that we need all three approaches simultaneously across all institutional types and all curricular areas. But we think that this agenda allows decision makers to consider multiple entry points to adapting their education systems to the climate crisis. Next slide, please. Why are we calling this a new green learning agenda? Because of its holistic approach to education for climate action and climate justice. This is really thinking about a breadth of green skills and not pigeonholing ourselves into just focusing on STEM skills, which are important, but really the broader breadth that's needed. Final slide, please. And I think maybe to end this presentation is really thinking about, okay, well, what about implementation? And this is where I'm focused on these days as sort of the next challenge. What does it mean to learn from and build on the energy and the momentum of young climate activists by bridging our work in the education sector and meeting them where they are to support not only the realization of their demands, but their preparation to enter a green workforce through education and workforce development opportunities, as well as youth entrepreneurship opportunities. Okay, I'm done. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Yolande. Thanks.
Christina, thank you so much. Comments just kept coming in. Said, what a great slide, great analysis, great presentation. So thank you for just firing us all. I'd like to turn it to all of us here. Questions, comments for Beth and Christina. This is your time. Again, what Beth and Christina have just presented is what we will zoom into more deeply for the next few months. And we hope that it will be a thread for all of you to connect with each other. One question that as people are putting their comments in, one question that came up early on was about books for books and materials on green skills and climate change. Is there for schools, for higher education institutions, is there anything that Christina or Beth would like to say about that? It was an early question.
Was it about the supply chain?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Supply chain, well, and I am not an expert on supply chain management, but I would definitely direct you towards the Global Book Alliance, which does an amazing job of thinking about these issues. I think that's mostly about thinking about the manufacturing and transportation of educational materials to get to the learners. So looking at where you're producing the materials, how close to the destination can you get that manufacturing, looking at the methods for transporting educational materials like books, packaging. I mean, there are just so many different very technical considerations that could be entry points into creating a more green supply chain for books and other educational materials. Again, not an expert on supply chain management, but I think that's kind of where we're going. And that's towards the idea that Christina was talking about this too, but looking at our education systems, looking inward at what the systems themselves are emitting or how we can do better in terms of our own emissions. And that's kind of the more technical level of the work.
Thank you, Beth. There's Christina, there's a question from Marco Berger talking about asking whether you think that the framework might be flexible enough to adapt with the developing world higher education systems context, and it's thinking more about Latin America. So I think the question is, how do we adapt it how do we contextualize it? Right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's sort of where my headspace is in right now. It's really thinking about the implementation, the contextualization, the localization aspects. And I think that gets in, so one of the primary conversations that I've been having is, how can we focus on this agenda when, for example, more basic or foundational skills have not yet been fully achieved across learning systems? And I think the whole sort of the underlying driver of this agenda, of this new green learning agenda, is to say that we can be teaching foundational skills and basic literacy, basic numeracy through this lens. And that's really thinking about how to pivot or even draw on locally contextual, relevant environmental challenges to teach those kinds of skills. And when it comes to more of a higher education learning environment, I think there's even more room for adapting this agenda into local contexts. And that's really thinking about, first identifying out of all the different higher education institution types, how does this breadth of green skills map across the kinds of learning opportunities that are offered by higher education institutions? And then where are those gaps? And how to then, build that breadth while also taking into consideration the local experience of climate change, and how to, again, leverage those experiences with the kinds of the more relevant skills that might be needed. So in the context of Latin America, it could be really thinking about droughts, and it could be thinking about how drought might be instilling a greater need for a certain set of technical capacities that, together with critical thinking and problem solving, can help generate and innovate new ways and locally contextually relevant ways of addressing agricultural processes that are affected by drought, or infrastructural issues that are affected by drought, and so on. So I think that it's about like considering what are the experiences of climate change, what kinds of skills are already offered, how to orient those existing offerings to more sustainability, climate action dimensions, and then building in the remaining gaps to provide the breadth of green skills.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. This leads us to a question of linking theory and practice, higher education institutions and students, and what's happening at the local level. And I'm wondering if any of the participants here, or Christina and Beth, have examples of how universities or education institutions work with communities. Are they interested in working with communities to do climate advocacy, climate resilience projects, things like that? Typically what it will always say, universities, they're more interested in the theory and they don't, it's not their job to be working on the ground with communities or students. Just wondering if you have examples or ideas on how to tackle that. Beth, Christina, any, or yeah.
I would actually like to pose that back to the audience and hear some other voices. So if there's anybody in the audience who wants to contribute to that question, or there were also a lot of really interesting examples of other types of climate action happening in your respective institutions. I would love to hear about those.
Thank you. Hamed?
Yeah, actually, that's a good question, especially when you mentioned something about collaboration between universities and communities. And that could be on different levels, local levels, US levels, and international levels. And I was thinking about the last thing you mentioned, which is climate advocacy. Climate advocacy should be based on research so that they are more convincing. So I wonder if USAID will, and that was my question on the screen, if USAID will release something like call for proposals for project ideas in this regard. For example, how can US educational system, both learning and research, contribute to the global problems through research projects, research-based advocacies, internships? We can involve the students on community serving projects, either locally in USA or internationally. And maybe Beth can answer if there is any plan under outcome strengthening partnership from your representation. Would be there any call for a proposal in the future? I would love to apply to this. I have a lot of ideas, actually.
Love the enthusiasm. I can't speak to future calls for proposals at this point, but I like the question. And I will say that we're super excited to see in the climate strategy, the most recent draft, that the climate leadership has really elevated the importance of youth leadership and education in the USAID climate strategy. And I would say, I haven't noted yet, but Gillian Caldwell, the senior climate change coordinator for the agency, is amazing, and she's doing a great job of hearing us about the importance of youth leadership in these issues.
Thank you. Yeah, so just stay tuned, Hamed, and all of us. I'd like it, Daria, are you here? I would love to have you talk more about the question.
Yes, hi everyone. Sorry, I can't turn
you.
on my camera right now. But I'm thinking about, kind of the environment that we're living in right now with misinformation. I feel like that kind of definitely affects all parts of life, including education. And so I'm wondering, before even implementing some of these really great strategies, how do we deal with some people denying climate change and just those kinds of issues? If we're going to kind of implement this and, empower young people, we have to kind of think of how do we even deal with this kind of challenge?
Anyone? Do you see it more, and do you see that as much in the developing world as in the developed world, Daria?
I don't know. I'm just thinking about how it seems to me like it really kind of is a global issue, especially considering how much time young people spend online and how digital skills are also becoming very important. And it just feels like kind of impacts, I mean, I feel like the whole world.
Maybe I'll jump in here for a second. I definitely don't have an answer for this. I think my personal opinion is that we don't have time for climate deniers, and we should just blaze through and address the climate crisis, and they will come around eventually. But that's my personal opinion. But I think, global surveys increasingly show heightened concern for the climate crisis. And so I think that when you look at, for example, Yale Center for Climate Communications does a really great global survey, and they do this as well as in the United States and in Europe, where they sort of segment population by their concern for the environment. And I think climate deniers are a very small portion of the global population, as well as in the United States, a very small portion of the population. So I think, there's one thing to keep in mind: the scale and the loudness of the voices of climate deniers versus the scale of the actual people who are concerned about the environment. And I think we need to focus our attention there. The second piece, which I completely forgot. So never mind. I was going to have a second point, but I've lost that train of thought. I do think we do need to address, though, the need to raise more public awareness about solutions. Global surveys, if, for example, even in Africa, the Afrobarometer put out a really, really great set of findings around their Pan-African awareness of climate change and climate solutions. And it does show that there's actually quite a big gap when it comes to just knowledge and awareness and language to be able to articulate what people are observing in their day-to-day lives, but aren't able to discuss because climate change education has not been in schools. It's not in the media often. So people aren't developing the language to be able to talk about what they're seeing. So I think that there is definite need to raise awareness within the public sector, within public society. And that could potentially help smooth over some of the rifts between those who might deny because they just simply don't have access to the information, and then those who do have concern for the environment. So
thank you. I think we're all with you on this. Let's just blaze through. Thank you, Christina. There's Thinley Chodan. You've had your hand raised for a while, and
yes,
sorry.
Hi, I did. Hi, this is my first time to a session like this, but I'm from Bhutan. And actually, I just wanted to say what Christina said before me, was that I think, although we may be saying we're singing to the choir, but I think the choir we need to organize the choir, right? I think climate change is something so big that people kind of don't know where to find the space of agency or find what the issue is, because climate change is kind of all encompassing depending on what perspective and what strategy you take. But I wanted to answer to Christina's earlier question of working with schools and projects. I don't know if it was Christina's question or if it was Beth's question. But, here in Bhutan, colleges and schools have, as a country, we are very pro-environment. So that helps, but also it works against us because we think we have great environment, our conservation is good, but then climate change, of course, is beyond just the environment and the nature. It's about human behavior, lifestyle, consumption, supply chain, and all of that. And I think here in colleges and schools in Bhutan, there are a lot of projects that are happening that is very climate or environment oriented. And I think also is a lot of that is also going to Christina's point of language and semantics. I think a lot of that gets conflated and therefore misunderstood or miscommunicated. But here in Bhutan, I would say the challenge is not about getting young people interested in climate change issues or having projects started on campuses. I think the biggest challenge is to take that project beyond the academic space. How do you scale it? How do you get on more actors, bigger actors to bring on more systemic change, or to, take it beyond just the campuses and make it, and going back to Christina's point of bridging this intellectual understanding to acquiring the needed skills and to kind of making it a livelihood, a green livelihood or a green job, or creating a green or contributing to the green economy, or what Christians, this new Green Deal. But I think that's the biggest challenge. And beyond Bhutan, I think our biggest challenge when we are in that global space is that we are so small, and everybody thinks Bhutan has everything figured out when it comes to the environment. So it's very difficult to bring up a narrative or bring up a point as to, we have a huge lacking in climate literacy, not in terms of deniers, but in terms of how do you figure out, how do you find your space in this big climate change that is happening. And a lot of the young people feel very helpless because they think it's beyond their control. Sorry, I went on.
No, this is great. I mean, we're running out of time, but Finley, this is excellent. Keep all these thoughts for a couple of months from now. We'll reach back to you because I think we have a lot to share. Just very quickly, Stephanie, can you move there we go. So more reminders on what's happening with the communities of practice. Next slide, we will be sending that to you. Thank you. Okay. Next community of practice meeting, we'll keep going with climate change, and we're going to tackle exactly what we talked about. We're hoping to work with the universities in Kenya to tell us how they're tackling it and bring it at the community level. We'd love to hear more from you. If you have examples like that, we could feature them. So please let us know. Thank you so much, Beth, Christina, all of you for your participation. It was great, and we will follow up. Have a great weekend, you all. This was terrific. Thank you,
everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks, you too.
You too.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks for the great questions and comments. Stay tuned. We're going to keep going with this.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.